Welcome to Bristol Ideas Online. I'm Andrew Kelly, Director of Festival of Ideas. An important theme for us in recent years has been the state of democracy. This year, we've extended this into a formal programme looking at the future of democracy and freedom of expression. We're interested in the state of democracy around the world, the lessons we can learn from places where democracy is growing or is in decline, and how we can apply those lessons here. To do this requires detailed information. We've used the reports issued by Freedom House a lot in our work, and we're delighted to be joined today by Amy Slipowitz, researcher at Freedom House and co-author of the recent reports Freedom in the World 2021, Democracy Under Siege, and Democracy Under Lockdown. Thank you for joining us, Amy.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to be here.
Amy, could we start by you telling us a little bit about Freedom House and the work you do on democracy? Because this is not a new project. You've got many decades of data to call upon, haven't you?
Yeah, so I'll start just by giving a brief overview of Freedom House as an organization. We're based in the United States. The research department specifically is in New York. And what we do is operate on the core conviction that freedom is able to flourish in democratic nations where governments are accountable to their people. So we work as an independent watchdog organization that's dedicated to the expansion of both freedom and democracy around the world. And one part of this is through our annual reporting. Freedom in the World is our flagship publication that assesses political rights and civil liberties in 210 countries and territories every year. We've been producing this report for nearly 50 years, since 1973.
Thanks, Amy. One thing that you report on in the new report is the 15th year of consecutive decline in democracy. Can you give us some of the I hesitate to call them highlights of this, but the key findings?
Yeah, the decline unfortunately really sped up in 2020. So what we mean by this is that more countries are trending down than are improving. And this is happening by the biggest margin since the deterioration began. So 2020 saw the biggest gap between the number of countries that improved and those that declined. Clearly, the authoritarian tide seems only to be getting stronger. And I'll highlight two themes that are kind of driving this. The first is China's role in this kind of long-term democratic decline. China is a really clear case of a country that is on the authoritarian offensive. So to take one example, in Hong Kong, Beijing has almost complete control, and by our measures, freedom in Hong Kong has dropped by 15 points over the past decade. This is a really huge drop, and in 2020, it lost 3 points alone because of the new national security law that has been used to arrest dozens of pro-democracy actors. Legislative elections were recently postponed again, and I would note that the Chinese regime's control in Hong Kong doesn't just violate the freedom of the territory's citizens, but it is also in breach of the one country, two systems promise that was made to Hong Kong's people. So clearly there's this theme where China is kind of disregarding international laws and norms. I think at the same time, it's also important to understand how China's influence ranges far beyond its own territory or even its region. Beijing really ramped up its global disinformation and censorship campaign after the initial coronavirus outbreak in order to kind of counter the fallout from its cover-up. It's also increased its meddling in domestic political discourse of foreign democracies, and it is extending its repression across borders. So it's committed rights abuses abroad that had long been common in mainland China. And then picking back up on the kind of international norms theme, the regime has really gained a lot of clout in multilateral institutions, such as the UN Human Rights Council. So along with its allies, China has been saying that it's pushing for non-interference in other countries' affairs, but really what it's doing is pushing for new norms that can allow abuses of democratic principles and human rights standards to go unpunished. So at the same time, authoritarians have been asserting themselves during this period of democratic decline. Key democracies have really shown an inconsistent presence on the global stage. They're not really delivering on the benefits of democracy, which is allowing authoritarians to step into the void and argue that they have the superior system. And then another theme I'll highlight from 2020 specifically is sort of the extinguishing of democratic hope. It really sped up over the last year. And I'll give a couple of examples to demonstrate this. So one is Armenia. Our scores have increased since the 2018 Velvet Revolution there ushered a reformist government into power. However, in 2020, after Armenia's prime minister capitulated in the war in Nagorno-Karabakh, the country has been showing signs of destabilization. So Armenia is currently facing a political crisis, which happened after the military called on the prime minister to resign. And worryingly, the prime minister is now calling the velvet phase of the revolution to be over. So there are snap elections that are scheduled in June, and these will be something to watch closely because elections can often tip a country into further instability. Why I'm highlighting Armenia specifically is because its signs of reversal are particularly significant as it's a bright spot in a region that is otherwise full of deeply entrenched dictators. So if we are going to turn around this democratic decline, it's really important to support struggling reformers like Armenia. And the second country I'll call out is Ethiopia. We were very encouraged when Prime Minister Abiy lifted restrictions on opposition media and political groups, and also released imprisoned journalists and rights defenders after he came to power in 2018. And Ethiopia's scores did improve for freedom in the world. However, we're seeing the devastating conflict right now in the Tigray region, and this is evidence of Ethiopia's unresolved ethnic and political tensions. And this caused their score to decline over the last year. So I would note Prime Minister Abiy was only appointed in 2018. So 2020 elections that have been delayed to June of this year were meant to be an opportunity for voters to give him a mandate to continue with his reform agenda. But instead, what we fear is that these elections, if they're held, will be an opportunity for further instability and further abuses to occur. And then lastly, I'll just talk about, we all saw the massive protests that broke out in 2019 around the world, but unfortunately, these have not yielded significant improvements. We tallied up 39 countries and territories that had a major protest in 2019. And of these, 23 saw their overall freedom decline in 2020. So that's almost 60% of protests leading later to a decline.
Thank you. I should mention that later on in this week, we're looking at democracy as the first part of our work. We do have an interview with two people from Hong Kong talking about what has been happening there. Before moving on to some more case studies, I just wanted to ask you to just explain just briefly the methodology you use, particularly to come to the scores that you have, because you break them down, don't you, into free, partly free, and not free countries.
Yeah, absolutely. So as I mentioned, Freedom in the World is looking at political rights and civil liberties in 210 countries and territories every year. And it's important to note that we're evaluating the state of freedom as it's experienced by people within specific borders. So we're not rating government performance specifically. And how we rate countries is by assigning scores on a 100-point scale using a methodology that is based on the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. So this covers categories like the electoral process, political pluralism and participation, functioning of government, freedom of expression and belief, associational and organizational rights, rule of law, and personal autonomy and individual rights. And so based on that assessment, we divide the world into free, partly free, and not free. So on the map, you'll see the green countries are free, the yellow are partly free, and the purple are not free.
Thank you. Let's look at some of the other case studies. One of the great values of your work is the number of countries you cover, and you've talked about some of perhaps the lesser known ones that we normally discuss just then. I wanted to talk about three that we do know very well. And the first is about Russia. Now, your score for Russia didn't change this year, which is interesting, but whenever we read about what's going on there, it seems to be new levels of authoritarianism are appearing fairly regularly. What's happening there?
Yeah, so Russia's scores are already very low, so there's not as much room to decline them further. But there were very concerning developments that occurred in 2020 there. The first one is that Putin was able to further consolidate his power by holding a rigged referendum that gives him the right to stay in his position through 2036. It also allows the president, with support from the upper parliamentary chamber, to remove judges from the constitutional and Supreme Courts. And then, of course, upon Alexei Navalny's return to Russia after being poisoned by the country's security services, he was falsely arrested and sentenced to over 2 years in prison. So this and other events have led in part to protests across the country. And this really shows that there is some growing discontent among citizens about the state of affairs in Russia. It's important also to flag that there are parliamentary elections that are set for September. So kind of in preparation for that, the regime has been selectively targeting opposition figures and supporters. I think Russia has played a really prominent role in its development of what we call modern authoritarianism. So rather than using blunt totalitarianism to crush dissent, as many regimes have done in the past, instead what they're doing is capturing key institutions, such as the media, the judiciary, civil society. And these tactics of kind of perverting what are ostensibly democratic institutions in order to serve autocratic ends are increasingly being adopted by numerous countries around the world.
The second country I wanted to ask you about is India, which in your rankings moved from free to partly free.
Yeah, one staggering statistic that we noted in 2020 is that less than 20% of all people now live in a free country. So this is the lowest we've seen since 1995. And one of the drivers of that is India's drop from free to partly free. This was a major blow to democracy. India does, of course, continue to hold very credible elections, but of course, democracy is about much more than just voting. So the decline has really been driven by Prime Minister Modi prioritizing his base over the inclusion and equal rights that the country was founded on. India has fallen a lot in civil liberties specifically. So just to give a few examples of why it has declined over the past few years. One is journalists are facing increasing pressure, harassment, and physical violence. So this past year, authorities did arrest dozens of journalists who had criticized the official pandemic response. So we also found that religious freedom has declined. Recent years have featured bigoted attacks, including lynchings aimed at Muslims. Academic freedom has suffered. There has been pressure in recent years with less room to discuss politically sensitive topics. The government has also tightened restrictions on foreign funding for NGOs, and separately it froze the assets of Amnesty International, which forced them to close down there. And then finally, for freedom of assembly, authorities severely cracked down on protests, especially those against the Discriminatory Citizenship Amendment Act that was passed late in 2019. I think as the world's largest democracy, India has the potential to serve as a real champion of democratic practice and a significant counterweight to authoritarian influence from countries like China. But instead, what we're seeing is Modi and his party driving India itself towards authoritarianism. And India does have a really vibrant and committed civil society. So they really need solidarity and support as they do the great work they're already doing to renew the liberal vision that India's democracy was founded on.
Thank you. The third country I want to look at is your own, the United States, which slipped quite a bit, didn't it, in your report? Tell us some of the story there.
Yeah, so first, the United States is still a free country. It does remain among the freest in the world, but its score did fall by 3 points in 2020 on our 100-point scale. So this doesn't seem like much, but it's actually a pretty large drop for an established democracy in a single year. And what's more, the decline is not new. We've actually been tracking a decline in the US's score over the past decade. So it's fallen by a total of 11 points during that time period. Some of the things we were particularly concerned about in 2020 were the mass arrests and violence against journalists at protests. There was also there was also dismissal of inspectors general and the undermining of other norms that are meant to hold government leaders accountable. And then there was also a lack of transparency around COVID-19 prevention and treatment and data. But what was especially damaging to US democracy were former President Trump's continuous attempts to overturn the will of the American voters. So he propagated baseless claims that the electoral system was ridden with fraud, and continued to do this even after the courts gave the claims fair hearing and rejected them. This really sowed doubt among a significant portion of Americans. So when democratic nations like the US backslide or show weakness, it really gives authoritarian actors something to point to and some space to claim that democracy is inherently inferior. So to take one example, Russian propagandists had a field day with the January 6th attacks on the Capitol. So it's really important for democratic countries to be credible in their efforts to support democracy around the world. And by doing this, they need to set a positive example addressing the weaknesses in their own democracies at home.
Now, we've talked about some of the declines and so on, but there are some good news stories, aren't there? I'm particularly interested in some of the ones that you covered in the report. And I want to talk about three in particular. The first is Taiwan, and why is that seen as a country advancing in terms of democracy?
Yeah, I think Taiwan is a good example of this kind of resistance against authoritarian pressures coming from outside, namely China. But specific things that have improved in Taiwan, one is over the past few years, the government has really improved on its transparency. And I think we saw this in action during the pandemic. The government was able to relay a very clear and thorough public health campaign, which was a key part in its successful response to the pandemic. And there was no need for Taiwan to resort to disproportionate restrictions on people's rights, like we saw in some more authoritarian or anti-democratic countries. And Taiwan also resisted a significant disinformation campaign from China during its 2020 elections.
The second one I wanted to ask you about was the Sudan, tell us what's improved there.
Yeah, Sudan has really been gaining in our scores since 2019, when military leaders and civilian protesters ousted Omar al-Bashir. In 2020, it did increase by 5 points. This came from the government's repeal of its apostasy law. There were more independent officials and student union leaders who were appointed at universities, which improved academic freedom. And authorities used less force against protesters than in past years. It is important to note that Sudan is still ranked as not free, so there's still a lot of work to be done, but the kind of positive trajectory we've seen over the last couple of years makes us hopeful.
And I think it's those examples of how a positive trajectory can work that's so important, really, and that's for advanced democracies, if we can call them that, to learn from as well. The third country I want to ask about was Malawi, which also increased its scores, didn't it?
Yeah, Malawi was a new improvement this year. They had a flawed election in 2019 that gave victory to the incumbent. The election commission, though, declined to call for a new vote based on these flaws in the process. So after that, the opposition candidates took the case to the Constitutional Court. And the court judges did resist multiple bribes and ruled that fresh elections needed to be held. So the election was in fact held last June, and the opposition won the new vote. I think this can be looked at as a really massive victory for judicial independence, and it can be a model for courts in the region and beyond. And we are seeing some improvements in other areas in Malawi. The new government has made some really good strides in its anti-corruption efforts, for example.
Before we come on to more general lessons that we can learn from your work, just tell us about the country we're in, the United Kingdom, which has a very high ranking, doesn't it?
It does. The United Kingdom remains free in our rankings. It has a total of 93 points out of 100. So it really is among the freest in the world and ranks very highly. Some of the reasons for this are that generally there are strong protections for political rights and civil liberties. There is robust political pluralism and participation, strong media freedom, and good associational and organizational rights. And I think the UK's review of its foreign policy and supporting democracy and freedom of expression worldwide is a really good thing, because the UK can play a key role in supporting democracy across the globe. But I think it needs to maintain its credibility in these efforts. So it is also important for the UK to strengthen its own democracy at home. There are some issues that remain. We noted in 2020, for example, concerns about potential bias and conflict of interest in the government's awarding of pandemic-related public contracts. So addressing these and other issues will only help to bolster the UK's support of democracy and freedom of expression worldwide.
And certainly some of the work that we're pursuing this year looks at some of those issues and more about the electoral system we have, for example, the way that House of Lords operates, and actually also the makeup of our parliament and where people come from. So we're learning lessons from you all over the world, really. What can we do then? Because one of the things we're very keen to do is to identify solutions, and you have many recommendations in your report. And I wonder whether we could start by saying what you've mentioned what Britain can do in terms of its foreign policy, and it has announced its integrated review of foreign policy, which it's trying to deal particularly with the challenge that China poses, and to remain as a trading nation with them. What can the free nations, the free democracies do to promote democracy elsewhere?
Yeah, so first I'll just say the work of kind of renewing democracy and building on it is an ongoing task. It's not enough to just hold an election, go through a peaceful transfer of power, declare that democracy has arrived, and then move on. There are just so many different facets of a democracy that I think I've alluded to. So maintaining or strengthening them does take continuous work, no matter which country you're in. So therefore, long-term support is really essential to reversing the long-term decline. There are so many things that democracies advocates can do to reverse the decline. So we need to have democratic governments supporting protest movements that are calling for reform. Foreign assistance should be emphasizing democracy strengthening programs. And of course, this assistance should be long-term and locally driven. So some examples of types of assistance can include supporting civil society and citizen-led social movements. This can be done through technical assistance and also training on issues like coalition and constituency building. Another program could be connecting activists across borders so that they can share strategies, tools, and approaches.
One of the things that always highlight a free society to me is the range and variety of civil society organizations. What role do they have particularly to play in promoting democracy, both within their own place, their own country, and elsewhere?
Yeah, I think civil society organizations are really key to bolstering democracy in whichever country they're in. I think it's really important to engage with local civil society. They're the ones who are working on the ground and know what's best and know the country context. So making sure to engage them and have solutions be really locally driven is really essential.
The next area I want to look at is about the role of the individual. I've always argued that, one of the most important roles an individual can play is to vote. People gave their lives in some cases to give me the right to vote. What more can individuals do as well as voting?
Yeah, so of course it's really key to participate in the political process, educate yourself on the candidates and where they stand on various issues. Beyond that, individuals can seek out information on what's happening in their home country and also around the world, and really speak out when they're seeing transgressions, whether at home or abroad. I think this can help pressure particularly democratic governments to ensure that their foreign policy takes a democratic and human rights oriented approach. And it also helps to hold their leaders accountable and make clear that the demand for democracy is not going to go away and is in fact the system that most people want.
The final area I wanted to, and there's many recommendations in your report, and we'll be providing links to the report on our website and in the chat and so on as part of this event. But it's about the role of civics. It's called, I think, civic education at the school level. I mean, when I was at school, I think we had one lesson on the democratic process. Some people went to visit a court and saw a trial in operation. Some of us, if I remember rightly, went to the local city hall, something like that, as a visit. But is there a need for a much more detailed and program on civic education, on civics, do you think?
Yeah, I absolutely think we should build on the types of things that you did when you were in school. One of the reasons is authoritarians are really good at touting the benefits of their own system, and democracies have really come up short on this kind of PR front. So civic education is a really good way to show people, especially young people, why democracy is the best system that we have and that this is the best system to protect people's rights. I think this also can tie back to what individuals can do. It can encourage them to speak out when they see abuses committed at home and abroad, and it'll strengthen democracy in the long term. And then in practical terms, of course, it depends on each country's education system and whether it's centralized or left to local governments. But there can be legislation passed that require schools or local governments to create basic content and various benchmarks of achievement for civic education that has this component of instructing students on democratic principles and why democracy is important. And of course, there should be teeth to this with adequate funding provided to carry all of this out.
One thing that we've always said, and I'm glad you said about democracy as an ongoing project, is about how, one thing I think we have let go in this country is certain aspects of democracy, and that we need to, do the PR much better, but really also to see this as what's called often a cathedral project, the work of many generations, and to make sure that we do keep renewing our democracy. And one of the issues, the final issue I wanted to talk to you about was another report you co-authored about democracy during the pandemic. And you've mentioned a few things during the conversation we've had today, but I wanted to ask you particularly about some of the findings of that report that you found that where governments had either taken powers or had restricted freedoms and so on, because these findings are quite serious, aren't they? On top of, in top of the findings of the main report.
Yeah, we actually did build on that democracy under lockdown report. So Freedom in the World also took a pretty thorough look at how COVID impacted democracy throughout the whole of 2020. And what we found was that there were 42 score declines across 36 countries and territories related to governments' responses to COVID. So it really helped drive the democratic decline this year and gave undemocratic leaders a great opportunity to consolidate power. They really took advantage of it. And we saw this in all types of countries, like backsliding democracies such as Hungary, wavering democracies like Sri Lanka, and even, of course, dictatorships like Cambodia. And one area where we saw significant declines was in transparency. There was a real lack of transparency, with governments across all types of regimes being just really less than forthcoming with COVID data. So some misled people about having the pandemic under control, others about treatments that turned out to be ineffective or even dangerous, like we saw in Brazil, or about the origins of the virus, like we saw in China and Russia. And then on the extreme, a handful, including Nicaragua and Turkmenistan, just denied the existence of the virus altogether. So when you have this severe lack of transparency, it really does impact people's lives, and it's very concerning. Another area that really suffered was freedom of expression. We calculated at least 91 countries that imposed new restrictions on the media as part of their pandemic response. And in many countries, it kind of broadened out to general freedom of expression, where everyday people who criticized their government's handling of COVID were harassed by the authorities and even arrested. A lot of new legislation was also put in place. So Cambodia, for example, enacted a new emergency law that further empowers the government to conduct surveillance and to punish expressions of dissent. Now, a common theme through all of this is that the impact of the pandemic does go far beyond justifiable restrictions in movement or assembly, and it seems like these policies and practices being put in place are going to last long after the health crisis has passed. I think we're already seeing this in places like Myanmar. So there, Aung San Suu Kyi and the president were charged for breaking COVID-19 rules against interacting with crowds, among other charges, of course. So COVID restrictions have really become another tool that authoritarian and anti-democratic actors are able to use to consolidate power. And then finally, I would just flag that the major economic recession that's resulted from the pandemic is bad news for democracy. So after the 2008 financial crisis, we did observe a decline in our freedom in the world scores. And it's likely that the latest recession is going to cause a similar destabilization of democracy. So we really need to be prepared to counteract that. We need to push the message that democracy can deliver on people's basic we need to be prepared to counteract that by pushing the message that democracy can deliver on people's basic concerns, and it can help ensure economic well-being in the medium and long term. And beyond just saying this, we need to back it up with actual policies.
And just one further example you gave in that report was the Philippines, where you had the president of the Philippines spreading false information was used as to stop online criticism. And we've got later on in April the journalist Maria Ressa, who's currently on trial in the Philippines, partly because of these changes that the president made.
Yeah, in the Philippines, we've seen a really severe restrictions on media freedom and freedom of expression. More generally, there was also the shuttering of a major independent news outlet last year, along with Maria Ressa's arrest. So the Philippines is definitely a country to be watching.
One final question, which is, when you prepare the report next year, do you think you'll continue to see a decline, or do you have hopes that things will change now?
I like to be optimistic and say that this decline is not irreversible. I think perhaps because it's gotten so bad, maybe this is a wake-up call for many people. In general, when democracies are functioning and you're not seeing such significant upheaval, it's very easy to take it for granted. So the fact that we're kind of all in this really severe democratic recession together could possibly catalyze more action and help us to kind of dig ourselves out of this hole.
Well, that's a good optimistic point to end on. Thank you, Amy, for joining us today. We'll post links in the chat and on our website to the Freedom House reports. There are many events coming up in our Democracy and Freedom of Expression programme and more will be launched soon. Do join us for these. Thank you again, Freedom House, for all your work. And thank you once again, Amy Slipowitz, for joining us today. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.